Story 1. The Old Woman in the Chair. James had always dismissed the notion of sleep paralysis as something rare and honestly not very scary. But that changed one night after he stayed up late working and fell asleep. Without even turning off his bedroom light, he woke up to find himself paralyzed, his body locked in place. He tried to move, to call for help, but his muscles refused to respond. A familiar heaviness settled on his chest, and he could feel his heartbeat thundering as panic rose in him. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something odd. The old, empty chair in his room wasn't empty anymore. An elderly woman sat there, hunched over with long, matted hair falling across her face. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress, and her skin was ashen, almost translucent in the dim light. Her presence filled him with a deep sense of dread and instinctual terror he couldn't explain. She sat completely still, her face obscured, her figure almost blending into the shadows. But he could feel her eyes on him, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He tried to look away, but his gaze remained fixed on her as though some unseen force held him there. Slowly, the old woman began to move, shifting in her seat, her joints cracking audibly. She leaned forward, her bony fingers clutching the armrests as if preparing to stand. Danes felt his chest tighten as she began to rise from the chair, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. She staggered toward him, her face still obscured, but he could see her mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. Just as she was inches from his face, she let out a guttural whisper, "I've been waiting." He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his body finally free, but he could still feel the chill of her presence lingering in the room, as if she was watching him even now. Story 2. The Shadow in the Mirror. Katie had always been afraid of mirrors in the dark. She avoided looking into them at night, fearing she might see something she shouldn't. But her fear took on a terrifying new reality one night when she woke up frozen, facing the mirror in her bedroom. Her body was paralyzed, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She could only move her eyes, which were locked onto her reflection. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't lying still, it was staring back at her, a twisted grin on its face. Katie's heart pounded as she realized that the figure in the mirror wasn't her at all. It looked like her, but its eyes were dark, hollow, and filled with malice. The reflection raised a hand, curling its fingers in a slow, deliberate wave, taunting her. She tried to scream, to turn away, but her body remained unresponsive. The figure in the mirror began to lean forward, pressing against the glass, as though it was trying to escape. Katie watched in horror as the glass began to ripple and the figure's hand pushed through, reaching toward her. She could feel its icy touch on her skin, a sensation so real it made her skin prickle. Finally, her body broke free from the paralysis and she scrambled away from the mirror. Gasping for air, she turned on every light in the room, but the image of her twisted reflection remained burned in her mind. And every time she looked in the mirror, she felt that sinister presence watching her, waiting for the next time she'd let her guard down. Story 3. The Heavy Breath. Daniel had grown used to staying up late, enjoying the quiet solitude of the night. But for the past month, he'd been experiencing something strange and terrifying. Every night, just after 3 a.m., he would wake up paralyzed, an oppressive weight pressing down on his chest. One night, as he lay there, trapped in his body, he heard a faint, labored breathing coming from somewhere close by. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it was the only thing he could hear. The breathing wasn't his own, and he could feel a presence near him, looming over him, close enough that he could feel its hot, wet breath on his neck. His heart raced, and his body remained locked in place, his muscles refusing to respond. Then he heard a voice, soft and sinister, whispering his name. "Daniel," it rasped, each syllable drawn out, dripping with malice. The voice was so close it was almost in his ear, and he could feel the presence pressing down on him as though it were trying to consume him. Finally, the pressure lifted and Daniel jolted awake, his body released from the paralysis. But he could still feel the presence lingering in the room, watching him from the shadows. Every night since, he's felt that heavy breath on his neck, a haunting reminder that he's not alone. Story 4. The Crawling Hands. Jess had always been fascinated by the supernatural, but she never imagined her curiosity would lead to an encounter so horrifying. It began after she spent a night binge watching horror movies and fell asleep late, her mind filled with eerie images. In the early hours, she woke up, her body paralyzed, unable to move or scream. She lay there staring at the ceiling when she felt a cold, bony hand wrapping around her ankle. Her heart raced as she realized that something was crawling up her body, its grip tightening with each inch. She tried to move to shake it off, but her body remained frozen. She felt more hands now, cold, skeletal fingers digging into her skin, pressing down on her arms, legs, even her neck. The pressure was suffocating, and she felt as though she were sinking into the mattress, being pulled down by the unseen hands. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them shadowy figures standing around her bed, their faces obscured, their hands reaching out toward her. One leaned in close, its hollow eyes staring into hers as it whispered, "Join us." In a flash, she was able to move again, sitting up in bed, gasping for air. The room was empty, but she could still feel the icy grip of those hands on her skin, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond her vision. Story 5, The Laughing Shadow. Tom had dealt with sleep issues for years, but nothing had ever been as terrifying as what he encountered one night in his new house. He woke up paralyzed, his body frozen in place, and he could feel an overwhelming sense of dread. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows in the corner of the room. The sound was soft at first, but it grew louder, filling his ears until it was the only thing he could hear. He sensed a presence in the shadows, watching him, mocking him with its laughter. Then he saw a dark figure, its silhouette tall and twisted, standing just beyond the edge of the light. It moved closer, its jerky, unnatural movement sending chills down his spine. He tried to scream, to move, but his body refused to obey. The figure stopped at the foot of his bed, leaning in close, its hollow eyes staring into his own. "I've been watching you," it whispered, its voice a harsh, mocking tone that made his blood run cold, waiting just as he felt the figure's cold fingers brushing against his skin. Paralysis lifted and he sat up, gasping for air. The room was empty, but he could still hear the echo of that twisted laughter in his mind, a reminder that the shadow was still watching, waiting for the next time he'd be vulnerable.